Our speaker today is Robert McDaniel. Through Florida State University, Mr. McDaniel has been providing operations planning, training, and exercise expertise in emergency management and domestic security to local, state, federal, and nonprofit agencies. Rob specializes and is a nationally recognized expert in disaster response, exercise design and development, and bioterrorism. We're going to get started because we have a lot to talk about today. Mr. McDaniel?
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for allowing me to do this for you today. And let's get to it because we have lots to talk about. Before we get started, I just want to set some expectations for our participants. This talk today, this will be an awareness level talk. Some of you might be interested in hearing about certificates of authorization, Part 107 licensure, special government interests, SGIs and things like that. Believe me when I tell you, we could spend an entire day on that. And in fact, I would tell you that any of you after this talk who want to start investigating the use of UAS within your own programs, you're going to be getting into those areas almost immediately to understand, and we'd be happy to talk to you about that. And there are plenty of resources online to understand about authorizations and licensure within flying. But we will be talking basically awareness level for this talk today and getting you up to speed on that. So why should you be listening to me? Well, we do run the a certificate program here at Florida State University and the use of UAS in public safety and emergency management. In addition to the fact that we continue to be the UAS representative in the State Emergency Response Team's Air Operations Branch during major disasters here in Florida. We also are a member of Task Force 8, one of our urban search and rescue teams here in Florida, and we have deployed with them twice now for Hurricane Matthew and for Hurricane Irma. And we are a member of and a big supporter of CRASAR. That's the Center for Robot Assisted Search and Rescue. That was an organization that was founded by a delightful lady, Dr. Robin Murphy from Texas A&M. And in matter of fact, the Texas A&M folks, along our team here from FSU, just returned from a deployment to Hawaii, where they were monitoring the volcano eruption and what it was doing to the area south of Hilo. And again, that's a story for another day. But just to let you know, the CRASAR is not only just about academics. The USA, the company, is a member. We have a number of private sector companies that are a member of it, government organizations as well. And we'll be talking a lot more about what CRASAR is really trying to do from a UAS standpoint, which is looking at standards. I'll primarily be talking about UAS from the standpoint of what we call small UAS. In other words, small UAS is defined by the FAA as anything under 55 pounds. When it comes to types of UAS, to help you get your mind wrapped around it, you see in the picture there, that's an example of a multi-rotor UAS. You can think of it if you're comparing them to a helicopter. In this particular case, it has multiple rotors. We call them multi-rotors. And they have the capability of flying by literally beating the air into submission. It is not the most efficient way to fly. The most efficient way are fixed wings, or what you would know as a regular aircraft or airplane that uses Bernoulli's theory of lift to keep it airborne, and then it's a much efficient way of doing things. But there are definite advantages to using each type. Fixed wings tend to have a longer flight time, and certainly with that can come range. Multi-rotors tend to be much shorter flight time, but they can get into tight places that fixed wings must continue to move forward to fly can't get to. Multi-rotors tend to be the thing that a lot of people are focused on right now. And not just the least of which, if you don't know what you need to do, you can literally just have it sit there and hover until you figure it out. From a cost standpoint, there are a number of different drones out there, small UAS that you can take advantage of. And they can range from from $100 to $1 million. What our research here at FSU has been focusing on is we tend to like to try to help rural and mid-sized jurisdictions within our state who can't afford a $500 an hour helicopter to help them get the situational awareness, or what you'll hear me talk about, the operational picture that they might need. So take advantage of these relatively inexpensive drone aircraft to give them that eye in the sky that can help them get around it. We are not engineers. We don't pretend to be. And in fact, we tend to focus on the off-the-shelf technology, looking how that can be used within public safety and emergency management, because it's affordable, it's sustainable, and certainly replaceable. So there are some, obviously, some benefits to looking at small UAS. The cost is one, is they are relatively inexpensive. There is a limited resource commitment. In other words, it is not like creating your piloted aviation unit. Public safety, we find some jurisdictions within Florida are creating a drone team to support many types of things within their community, not just public safety, but even economic development, planning, redistricting, all kinds of. Certainly, UAS have their limitations, one being range, flight time, FAA restrictions, and again, we won't be going into a great deal of detail about that. But all of these things can that I'm talking about can have an impact on how the FAA allows you to use them. We are restricted to, in some cases, to line of sight. In other words, aircraft can't be out of the line of sight of the pilot on the ground platform. Certainly, we don't fly these aircraft over people, and there's different definitions of that. Night operations, there are altitude restrictions, all kinds of things. Here's the thing we'd like you to remember, though, that we like to say that all things are waivable, and I'll get to that as my last comment when we get into how to develop your own program. So you can see by our definition here, U.S. can provide an increased situational awareness to better inform a decision maker who is managing an incident, and in some very, very, very limited direct assistance in life saving. When we think about robots in general, and this is the way we think about them within CRASAR, we want these robots to do the things that humans don't want to do. We don't want to do the dull stuff. We don't want to do the dirty stuff. And we certainly don't want to do the dangerous stuff if we can get away with it. Now, I'm going to speak here for a moment about perception about UAS. Certainly, public safety professionals, even within my own state, who I've had numerous conversations with, sometimes tend to see drones and UAS, small UAS, as toys. We try to dissuade them from that. There's also perception for the public about privacy issues. I'm sure you're all quite aware of that. There's perhaps a misconception, certainly that's something that our field experience and our research has indicated, that drones can be used as a strategic asset. And I'm going to argue with that for just a minute. We very much think that drones, small UAS, are a tactical asset at this point. And the reason is because in Florida, of course, we tend to get our share of bad situations, blue sky versus gray sky. And when we plan for gray sky, and in gray skies, we lose things like cell towers and communications capabilities. And when we do, we're working very much in a data management degraded environment. So much so that if we're collating tons of data, get that to people away from on scene can be very, very difficult because of bandwidth. We have even gotten to the point where we have procedures in place that if we've got really important information that we've gathered from our UAS, we will literally dump it through a thumb drive and sneaker net it. And by that, we mean literally get in the car and drive it to the next place that we can find internet connectivity so that it can be shared with the world. Because in Florida, in a lot of cases, we're dealing with a communications degradation environment. But even in blue skies environment, we find that the 4K video that we're able to provide an on-scene commander in a tactical environment, we have to degrade so that it's less than 4K when we're streaming it online. So until we get to get data management down and get the bandwidth that's needed, we continue to think, at least from our perspective, of UAS as a tactical asset. Another perception I'll just bring up very briefly is one misconception is that aviation thinks that UAS is trying to take over their job, and nothing could be further from the truth. I'm an old Air Force aviator. I have 2,000 hours in B-52s, and I know that there are things that UAS can't do that I could do in an airplane. It's just a misperception. And in fact, the people that we have been able to work with in piloted aviation, specifically things like sheriff office helicopters, have actually kind of marveled at of teaming with us and the things that we can help them do and the things that they can help us. Now, through some of the use cases that we have in using UAS within public safety and emergency management. And of course, the first thing I would remind you is that this is all about situational awareness. It's our ability to identify and comprehend the things that are going on out there so that we can do the mission that we've been given better. The other thing that I would have you think about when we're talking about situational awareness is the common operating picture. You understand, those of you who are familiar with NIMS and ICS understand that being able to understand what's going on from the same picture by multiple responders, multiple agencies is really, really important. And what we've been able to find is that UAS can provide an outstanding ability to provide situational awareness that can then be shared across platforms and agencies so that everyone's working literally off the same sheet of music. So let's move on and talk about how we might use UAS from a search and rescue standpoint from structures. And again, this is all use cases that we in our program have explored. The first is this. This is from an exercise we conducted with Urban Search and Rescue Task Force 4 out of Orlando about 4 years ago now. This is the Lakeland Fire Tower in Lakeland, Florida. It was a site of an exercise where they said, well, this is a partially collapsed structure. We pulled up, we looked to the incident commander and said, what do you want? He says, I need to see the roof. And 30 seconds later, we handed him an iPad and we were showing him 4K video of the roof. The importance there, I don't think, can be understated in that it would have taken that same incident commander and certainly multiple fire crews to gain a similar kind of advantage in looking at the roof. We were able to do that literally within 30 seconds. And any of you who are familiar with fire operations understand the importance of that. So when the first thing that we think about in structural search and rescue is we've got elevated structures, we've got elevated roofs, and the ability to literally get airborne and get an aerial view of that, which would otherwise require someone to climb up there and take a look at it, and then entering that firefighter's life is a big, big advantage. And we can do it almost immediately, literally 30 seconds after we jumped out of the truck. The other thing I would tell you about this too is to think about looking through and clearing rooms. You have to be careful about that. Certainly, you can fly a drone in through a window that might be open. That can be a very difficult thing, and you might lose the drone the second that it loses contact with the GPS satellites that might be keeping it stabilized. But there are other techniques. You can adjust literally while the bird is in the air. You can adjust camera exposure so that on a bright sunny day, not unlike the one that's depicted in the picture here, You can blow out the exposure. You can actually see into a dark room and see the contents, so that if there is someone in there, or if there is something going on in a specific room, that those who are attacking the collapsed or damaged structure need to know about, you're able to give them that heads up at that moment. Let's move on now and talk about UAS from a 3D modeling standpoint. I'm going to run a video here for a moment. This is a YouTube video. Let's see if we can get it to work. Great. So 3D modeling is actually something that surprises people. This is a capability because the drone knows where it is in a three-dimensional space, because it's getting information from GPS satellites, and because it knows where the angle of its camera, it can take a representation of what would normally be a 2D or flat environment, and then can be rendered, because it knows where it is in that 3D space, to create a pretty decent, accurate 3D model. One that's doing naturally all that great a model. You can see some of the wavy lines and some of the inattention to detail, but this was done relatively quickly, and by that I mean it probably took a couple of hours to create this 3D model of this small neighborhood. It's a rather crude rendering, but it is possible, and this again kind of opens up some areas where we might be able to use this in the urban search and rescue situation. Say, for instance, we're back at that collapsed tower, and we're having to look for folks in it. A 3D model might be helpful to the incident commander to decide where their firefighters and searchers are going to enter and exit, places to stay away from within the structure as well. These are all things that are possible and that we have done. Let's now move on to wide area search. And this is a picture, again, from that exercise from about 4 years ago. This was, believe it or not, a paintball field that we were allowed to use as an exercise area for Task Force 4. And I hope that this picture kind of gives you an idea of the relative, the very different view that you can get of an area when you're not ground level. And in fact, you see a number of upright pipes. The first thing they asked us to do, because they thought that there might be victims within these pipes, actually had us hover over the pipes, turn the camera down, look into these pipes to clear them, so that a firefighter literally didn't have to take a on these in there. It's from an elevated structure standpoint, it's a really neat thing. The other thing that is important that we learned in wide area searches for people was that it's helpful to identify areas of interest. In other words, we're not always necessarily going to see the victims, even with 4K video. But what we might be able to do is identify areas where there might be victims, and or maybe even exclude areas. By exclusion, I mean perhaps lower priority areas. We can swing through an open area where we can really quick look to see if we see anything that's obvious, and if we don't, then perhaps that area can be lower prioritized. I mean, we won't get to it eventually if we don't find anybody, but it can be lower prioritized for areas which the drone can't necessarily sweep through and quickly identify that there's no one there. Very much like this. By the way, when we flew over this area, there were 4 victims that were out in the open that we never saw. So drones are not the end-all, be-all of search and rescue. They are simply a tool, just like anything else. The one on the upper left is where we were embedded with the team. If you see the very faintly the gentleman in the light blue shirt, he's flying the UAS. Right next to him is the search team leader, who has an iPad in their hand and is looking at the video that we're streaming live from the bird. Lower left is a picture of the very first victim that was found during this exercise. The UAS team did find that. In fact, you can just see the foot of the dummy sticking out from underneath the rock, and you can see the little light blue paper, which is, of course, the victim card for that. Upper right corner is the team actually arriving on scene to rescue the victim and then them hauling it off later. So I also tell you this, to be completely honest. Remember, as a researcher and as an academic researcher, my job is to also figure out what doesn't work. There were other victims in this field that we look for, that we were looking right at, and we never saw. And so again, UAS is a tool. It's going to work for you sometimes. It's not going to work for you sometimes. It's just like anything else that we use out there. You want to use it to its best advantage, and sometimes it's going to help you. Let's move on and talk about search and rescue from an isolated victims or lifeguards or swift water standpoint. We're going to show you examples of all of these. The picture on the left that you see there is of a gentleman in Dubai on a, he was a window washer on one of the world's tallest buildings, and his window washing his gantry there broke, and there were very few options about how to help this guy because he was so far up. As it turns out, local law enforcement there had a drone with camera and a speaker on it, and was literally able to fly the drone up, tell this young man how to fix the gantry that he's on there, the platform, and he was able to rescue himself. If you look on the right, this is another example. Very small drone. That's a DJI. Drawing a blank now, of course. A small DJI drone used by a local cable company to help string cable. They use the drone to pull a piece of fishing line to where they need it. That fishing line is then attached to rope. That rope is then attached to the cable, and now a small village that never had internet connection before now has it. We've also done some research with regard to this about streaming video and speakers on our drones. Frankly, we've had very mixed results. For a speaker to be loud enough, it's going to be heavy, at least at this point. And believe me, we have used the speakers that can be put on an iPad or your cell phone, and they just do not put out enough decibels to overcome the rotor noise from the drone. You certainly can't, if you were able to speak to a victim from the drone itself, like the one there depicted in Dubai, it would probably be a special bird. In addition, you would not be able to be heard if you spoke back to it. So what we then started focusing on, which is what I'll talk about next, is the idea of, well, dropping a communications device to that isolated victim. And in fact, very, very simple mechanisms can be put together to drop a short range UHF radio, family radio, if you would, to victims, so that you can talk to them, tell them what they need to do to help themselves, or what they need to do to prepare for the help that you're going to be bringing them. So, as I alluded to just a moment ago, drop mechanisms are certainly something that we have in UAS that can be useful. In this particular case, you see a picture of a water-activated flotation device that can be dropped to someone who is in need. It's a lifeguard kind of situation. Speakers can be also put on drones. As I said before, you'll need to get one that has a loud enough speaker, because the small commercial ones that you could probably get away with flying on, something like depicted there, that I believe a DJI Phantom, are just not loud enough to get through. Pretty cool though when you think about the idea that if you're out lifeguarding and you've got an individual maybe 200-300 yards offshore, it's going to take time for that lifeguard to get there. Literally within seconds, you can have the drone overhead dropping some assistance, or telling via speaker the individual that they're way too far out. It's time for them to come back in, and the lifeguards normally do that using whistles. So it's definitely an advantage and has worked in the past. This next picture was something that happened in Texas during floods a couple of years ago. You can barely see, you can see the gentleman holding the line. That's a drone on the other end of it. In the upper right was taking this line out to a man and a woman whose mobile home was in the middle of obviously a swift water incident. You can drop lines. You can drop. In fact, this gentleman and his wife got flotation devices dropped to them from the same drone. And as I said, we have used it in the past to drop radios so that the victims we can communicate directly with them. A really interesting area that we've started working on, and has been rather fun actually, is working with search and rescue dog teams. This picture here, you can barely see. There's a dog team down there, and the white individual in the middle of the picture is the subject of the search. Again, what we found when helping with search dog teams, the first big thing is being able to do reconnaissance over terrain. If you've ever run a scent dog like that, you're not running that dog is running you. And consequently, they can get very focused on following a scent and can get themselves actually into trouble pretty quickly with terrain. There's stories of dogs that have literally, at a full run, gone right off of fairly tall cliffs and taken their runner right with them. So knowing the terrain before the dog goes out can be important. Also, as with the wide area search that I mentioned before, it can be helpful to exclude areas. In fact, one of the things that we found in working with dog teams, and we've done so on a number of occasions, was that especially with searching for those who might be lost, to have autism, dementia, Alzheimer's, they tend to actually move towards water sources. And so the first thing that we're asked to do when we arrive on scene is get up in the air and find the water sources within our local search area, so that we can send somebody over there and start looking for them there. Another type of dog team are apprehension dogs, or what some might call bite dogs, for looking for criminals. Again, reconnaissance and monitoring of the area that the dog's about to go into. You can imagine being a sheriff's deputy on the trail of an armed suspect. The last thing in the world they want to do is go running around a corner and have that suspect found there waiting for them. And so we have practiced on numerous occasions with apprehension dog teams in clearing the corners, if you would, in areas where the suspect that they're trying to apprehend could surprise them. And we've also worked with cadaver dogs. Interesting enough, what we've learned was that these cadaver dogs that are looking for the scent of dead remains, they cheat because very often the trainers, as they train them, have to walk the scent out to where they want the dog, and the dog will literally just follow the scent of the trainer. And so, believe it or not, we've actually dropped scent samples of human remains from a drone so that the dog couldn't cheat, and the dogs did outstanding. It was really, really impressive to see them work like that. Let's move on briefly. Some of the obvious things would include use at a structural fire. You can imagine an incident commander who wants to know where his or her people are, the situation on the ground with regards to the structure, hot spots, room clearing. All of these things would be important to an incident commander, as would perhaps the use of forward-looking infrared. There are a handful of small UAS out there now that do have some infrared capability, some better than others. Here's the thing I would tell you about those so that we can be very clear about how they work. They don't work like they Hollywood would have you think they work. They do not see through walls. Infrared does not see through walls. It does not even see through clear glass. It does not see underwater. Infrared only sees the surface temperatures of things. In other words, if it was looking at a clear plane of glass, it would see nothing through the glass. If you put your hand up against that glass, it would then see the heat of your hand being transferred to the glass and would see your handprint, but wouldn't necessarily see through the glass. We would obviously use this in a number of different situations, and some of which I'll talk about here in just a few minutes. Let's talk about wildland firefighting. Some obvious and not so obvious results from UAS with wildfires. The first thing that we always hear during a wildfire, or a prescribed burn for that matter, is we want to see the backside of the fire. In other words, where the fire is going. The problem with that is that's definitely where the smoke is going as well. And in fact, we have a hard time seeing through the smoke. So again, one of those use cases, which is not necessarily great, but there are some ways that we can get around that, including following the fire line and using mapping to follow its advance, especially if you have teams on the backside of the fire that are working it. You're going to want to know that these fire lines don't move linearly. Some parts will advance while others hang back. And this is how teams that are on the backside getting ready for that line to arrive can get themselves into trouble. It would be remiss of me, however, to not mention the fact that when it comes to forestry, you've got to coordinate with the forestry people. It's a very, very complex environment when air attack is used in forestry. I know this from my Air Force experience. It's very dangerous. And so unless you're working with command, stay the heck out of there. Don't be flying your UAS in there. And certainly if you see any civilians doing that, they need to get out of there as well. They could literally be hampering our ability to fight those fires. However, I will also tell you that the U.S. Forest Service is integrating UAS within their air attack system. And so they recognize the value as well. They just want to make sure that they're able to do their job free of anyone who is not part of the command. I'm going to move through prescribed burning because I think we've talked about that. Let's get to one of the maybe the more important ones, which is hazmat. This is a fantastic use case when it comes to UAS, and specifically the idea that in this situation, not unlike the one that's depicted here, normally a hazardous materials team, two-person team would have to suit up in moon suits, walk down to where this trailer is from the cold zone, and try to identify what's going on and then walk back. And any of you who have done this before understand how strenuous this is. It takes, they get about 20 minutes of working time within these suits, and then you're absolutely exhausted. So you can imagine how important it would be then to perhaps, instead of sending two humans into what could potentially be a very dangerous situation, we'll send a drone down there and take a look. Well, the next question is always, well, wait a minute. What about the drone? Won't it be contaminated? We don't care. One of those level A hazmat suits costs somewhere around $1,500 a piece. The drone that we would send down there wouldn't cost any more than that, and just saved us the hazard of having to send two live humans to do the same job. Doesn't mean that hazmat teams won't have to go down there eventually. But it does mean that we don't have to expose humans to these dangerous situations all the time. The next slide is a photograph of some friends of ours who have actually, at South Manatee Fire here in Florida, who've actually developed a 3D printed a mount that will allow them to put on a 4-gas meter radiological monitor so that they can fly it into an area, actually turn the camera around as you see depicted here on this DJI Inspire, and actually look at the readings. And that is as simple as it comes, folks, and incredibly effective. And we were just astounded that they were able to pull that off. This is a photograph of an infrared use on a propane tank. If you notice, the bottom half of that propane tank is dark. That's where the liquid actually is. Remember, infrared only looks at the surface temperature of something. And so where that liquid is in contact with the surface of that tank, you can tell it's colder. In this particular, we're using what's called white is hot palette. In this particular case, we can actually tell how much propane is actually in that tank. Again, another wonderful resource. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about law enforcement because it's something that we don't have a great deal of experience with here in Florida, because we actually have some privacy laws here in Florida that restrict law enforcement's use of UAS as it stands now. And so the thing I think I would most have you think about when it comes to using UAS in your jurisdictions is you'd better check on your state statutes, your local statutes about how UAS imagery might be used. In Florida, we have some pretty heavy restrictions. It does hamper our ability to do some things, and in fact, law enforcement has not embraced UAS to a great degree here in Florida. Fire has, emergency management has, but law enforcement needs to stay away from it from an evidentiary standpoint. So again, I really encourage you to look at where you're going to use these and how you're going to use them. So moving on, let's talk about live streaming. This is a picture of us streaming some video from a drone during one of the Florida state-wide hurricane exercises. Interestingly enough, although on scene we were getting 4K video, as I said earlier, we were not able to actually broadcast 4K video via the web just because of the bandwidth limitations. We were out in the woods, and all we had were cell signals. In this particular case, our colleagues still thought it was really cool in the state EOC. And indeed, my colleagues who were actually traveling in Turkey at the time actually watched the same stream from the other side of the planet, which gives you some perspective about how it can be used. Cassandra, I'm going to stop here for a moment and just say that I'm going to go for about 3 or 4 more minutes, and then we'll get into questions, okay?
Okay, great.
So specifically from an emergency management standpoint, you can imagine some of the uses that we would be interested in, specifically from a damage assessment and reconnaissance standpoint. This is some drone footage of an area that was impacted by a tornado. We've done some talking over the last year with FEMA with regards to how UAS imagery might be used in the future with regards to doing damage assessment. There are some protocols that in Region 4 have been put in place and that we actually got to test during our response to Hurricane Irma. And those are all possibilities. There's still some things in the way. FEMA does not pay for aircraft imagery unless it's associated with Cat V life safety, and so there's still some obstacles in the way, but we're trying to work through that with FEMA because of the obvious advantages. To give you an idea of that, we were asked to go to Collier County in Southwest Florida for Hurricane Irma. We did all of their public assistance damage assessments looking at facilities that were owned by government in 4 days. 3 UAS teams using this FEMA protocol that we talked about imaged 394 different critical facilities within Collier County. And that information was taken right back to the EOC, which was then put into their GIS system, their Geographic Information System, and used. And we're quite proud of that. This is a picture of a country western concert in North Florida that happened a couple of years ago. They opened the gates to this special event too early, and indeed the crowd got right up next to the stage, got packed in. There was no water available. It was a blistering hot day, and people started falling out from heat stroke, heat stress. Over 60 people were transported. You can see the firefighter there just trying to hose down the crowd to keep them from passing out. And the emergency manager said to me, who's a friend of mine, later said, "I really wish I had UAS overhead, it would have helped me pick out where the problems were before they became problems and where my biggest need was with regards to EMS. So even in a mass casualty situation, special events, a UAS can be beneficial. Obviously, there are some prohibitions, especially when it comes to large stadiums during football games and other sporting events. You should take note of that, but they certainly can be useful in helping manage what might be a large special event or large mass casualty. Here's a picture of some of the bridge inspections that we did when we were asked by the state of Texas and Texas A&M to come over for Hurricane Harvey. One of the big problems that the jurisdiction that I was in had was in Fort Bend County was they had just gotten through with a flood a year before. They had a lot of half rebuilt infrastructure. A lot of it was not where people could get to see it, and so we were able to fly the drones into rather unusual and frankly dangerous situations, only to the drone itself, so that we could image and show them what the condition of those structures were. Really briefly, I want to talk about some of the environmental things that we're doing with our program here as well. The first off, again, a longtime colleague of mine in St. Johns County, St. Augustine, Florida, during Matthew, let me know that they lost $21 million of sand off the beach. Now, that might not sound like a big deal to some of you, but sand in Florida is a really, really, really big deal. And so consequently, we've already had some discussions with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and done some tests on sand and beach erosion, being able to, some of you who have a storm surge concern when it comes to your coastlines, understand how important dune systems are, and being able to model those and correctly identify the height and the amount of sand that are in those places to help protect the things that are behind them are very, very important to us. And in fact, we're doing some of that now. In addition to that, we are also doing some things about monitoring sensitive environmental areas in some endangered species, invasive species. Specifically, some of you may know that we have a real snake problem down in the Everglades with pythons, and I believe there's even a drone out there that's specifically equipped to find pythons out in the Everglades now, which is a big deal. We've even done some work in archaeology and identifying old Civil War sites that have been previously urbanized, and we've had some success doing that as well. Cassandra, 2 more minutes, and I promise I'll get out of it.
Okay.
So those of you who are wondering what you should do next, if you want to start a program, the first thing we'd have you do is talk to your risk manager and your local, your county, state attorney. They're going to absolutely have an impact in their views on how UAS is used within that jurisdiction. You need to speak with them. If you don't speak with them first and you go out and you start doing some things, you might find that you're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of money on something that ultimately they're going to say, no, you can't do. That is the absolute first place that you should start. Talk to your risk management folks. The next thing we would encourage you to do is to start thinking about what you want to do with your UAS. Specifically, what's the mission? And define that and be very, very specific. We have a saying that the first question you shouldn't ask is, what drone should I buy? The first thing you should ask is, what is the mission? What is the payload that will allow me to accomplish that mission? Once you know what the payload is, the camera, sensor, whatever it is that you have to, that will help you do the mission, then you go find the drone that has or can carry that payload. If you don't, you might find yourself buying a lot more drone than you actually need. Who's going to run the program? What are my budget concerns? Are we going to use existing personnel to do this? What are our liabilities? Do we need insurance? Some of you are going to be, jurisdictions are going to be self-insured. Some of you are going to have programs that are going to require some specific insurance. to what standard are we going to train our operators? And this is something that we're working on within CRASAR to identify some very specific training standards. What will our standard operating procedures look like? Are these? I can tell you from 5 years of experience with UAS now, you will need to service them and you will need to repair them. At some point, you will crash your drone. So take that into consideration. You're certainly going to want to make sure that they're operable and that you maintain them as such. So what about standards? Well, at this very moment, when we're talking through this video, there are no globally accepted standards. There are plenty of people working on them, though. The National Fire Prevention Association, ASTM, National Association for Search and Rescue, and as I said, CRASAR, the organization we belong to, is working with them as well. And in fact, we're trying to incorporate what all the others are doing into what we're doing. Also, it's important to understand that if you're in emergency management, that typing of resources is very, very important. CRASAR has started tackling that issue head on. And in fact, we're providing some information to FEMA and to NFPA on typing and how those resources are asked for, and ultimately, we hope can be reimbursed. You can imagine, though, that without any standards or training programs in place, you're asking for a lot of problems. And so we would encourage you to encapsulate all of it. All right, last slides. Fly before you buy. Don't buy anything that you've never used before or that you haven't seen fly. Remember that payload is always the most important thing. 2 is 1, 1 is none. This is from the Air Force. In other words, something will break, and if you don't want to be in the field with only one drone, it break, and now you can't perform your mission. Please understand that sales reps for companies that will sell you drones don't always know what you're talking about or what their drones can do. Don't buy more drone than you need. And just because a drone can do something doesn't necessarily mean it should do something. With that, I'm going to stop there. And Cassandra, I know that you have a number of questions, so let's get to those and see if we can get that done before we run out of time.
Yeah, so the first one, I'm going to dovetail because you started touching on it, was Joe asked, are there any recommendations that you can give for suppliers for custom USA equipment and packages?
No, in fact, as I said at the beginning of our talk today, our focus has been what we can obtain off the shelf. We're not engineers, and obviously, because I'm a government official and with the university, it probably wouldn't be a good idea for me to start throwing out names of companies that can provide them. I will just say, though, that there are some good ones, and there are plenty of not so good ones. And so the buyer needs to beware. Don't buy before you fly. It sounds great on paper or on a website, and it may not be able to do the things that you think it will do. So go out, try it out, make them show you it will do what will accomplish your mission, and then spend your money. Next.
Are there any grant programs available for emergency management organizations who want to start a USA program? This is also from Joe.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even within our state of Florida, we have base grant funds that are provided to local governments, and then competitive grant funds. And I have not yet seen a competitive grant fund for local governments coming from the state pool of competitive grant monies. I don't believe that there are any monies at the federal level yet that are available for UAS. A little less sure about fire service and fire equipment grants. I would encourage you to talk to your local program manager, have them run that up through the people who run those programs, and see where that lands.
We had another question on operations. How do you notify the public that you have a UAS or drone operating in the area?
Interesting. So the first thing you do is you put out what's called a NOTAM, a notice to airmen, when you're going to be flying in an area. We're not. So this is where we get into very, very technical legal situations, and I can only speak to what we know here in Florida. In Florida, because of a statute, Florida Statute 934.5, we, in general, there are some exceptions, but in general are prohibited from imaging private property without the property owner's permission. So you can imagine that if we've got a tornado touchdown somewhere and a number of structures throughout a neighborhood are impacted, technically, if we were to go out, we would have to get permission from every single one of those property owners before we imaged those properties. Now, again, this is just in Florida. Your state, your local regulations might differ, and probably do differ. Or if we did not get those permissions, we could literally be sued. So it's important for you to understand local law. Now, if it was used for life safety, then yes, we could do it. But if it was just used for damage assessment, we probably couldn't. What's interesting about that is that during Hurricane Irma, we only did damage assessment for publicly owned facilities in Collier County. Their critical facilities list, not the private sector. We just couldn't do it. Statute would not allow.
And then we had another question about if you had any guidance on when you're looking at drones to use like over water or during floods, if you had any recommendations about that.
Yeah, again, I would be very leery about recommending a specific brand or specific company or anything like that. To suffice it to say that there are off-the-shelf drones that are perfectly capable of doing those missions, and that you should do a lot of investigating and a lot of talking before you go out and spend your money.
Great, thank you. Were there any other questions? You can place them in the Q&A section or in the chat on the right. Anyone else? We're getting thank yous, but I don't see any other questions.
Well, just before we go, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for the opportunity. And really encourage you take a good hard look at what UAS may be able to bring. I hope this talk spurred your imagination about how it might solve a problem for you, your jurisdiction. And certainly Cassandra and Tom have my contact information, and should you like to reach out, we'd be more than happy to talk to you.
And thank you all for attending. Again, we'll have some of this information up on the website at safeandready.org, or feel free to reach out to Tom or me, and if you had any other questions. Thank you.